This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome into the podcast, friends. I'm Randy Moore, Pastor Randy Moore, the associate pastor at Methodist Temple in Evansville, joined as always by the lead pastor here, Pastor Andy Payton. It's good to have you with us. We are in the midst of another series here in the month of November on service, but we've also just gone through an election. We got into it a little bit last week, Pastor Andy, but I'm sure we're going to get into it today because it came up in your sermon, which was the first sermon after Election Day last week.
Yep. I mean, it's what's on our minds, and I felt like I had to speak to it in terms of our worship. And when something like that happens in the world, even if we're in a series, I always end up going toward what's happening in the world, because as pastors, you know, our role is to try to, ask the question, what's God calling us to do in the midst of this? How is the gospel relevant in the midst of this? How does it give us hope in the midst of it as well?
Yeah, the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand, or your favorite television newscast.
Wasn't that? Karl Barth said that, I think.
I think so. Yeah. But yeah, to be blind to what's going on in the world and just going on as if nothing happened would not be responsible. So yeah, it was natural that it came up. So the text that we're working with, and it's interesting how many times you don't have to shoehorn the text into an application if you're paying attention to what's going on in the world. It's just Scripture's kind of that way that sometimes it just speaks when you don't think it's going to speak. So your text came from the Gospel of Mark in the 12th chapter, a very familiar story known as the widow's mite. Let me read it because that is the text, and then you started your message talking about the election and maybe what the attitude should be from the losers and what the attitude might be from the winners. So here's the text. That's Mark 12:38-44. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came out and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." So I think if we want to sort of jump to an application that's connected to the election, we might say that she gave all that she had into the temple treasury. She didn't hold back anything for the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or her favorite candidate. She put her investment, she voted for God. And so I think that's kind of a message that's apparent right there. And another one, which works almost any time, is that it is true that people give out of their abundance. I think I give out of my abundance. I really do think I give out of my abundance. And I wonder what I would do if I just had a penny. I think I'd probably want to cling to it, use that as a starting point for building something bigger, not giving it all away. But she gave it all away for what had meaning and purpose in her life.
Such a challenging text, especially when, as you're saying, we think about our culture and our lives today, and we are saturated with abundance. And Jesus, he talks so much about money, the use of money. And I was just reading a lesson this morning during my devotions, and it's one from Luke right now, the daily office. So it's like the daily lectionary. The daily office is in Luke, and the passage that I read says, Jesus says to his disciples, "You have to give up all your possessions and come follow me." And now there's a literal sense how to apply that verse, and then there's a figurative sense how to apply that verse. Some people have taken it both ways. But yeah, she certainly has given everything she has and dedicated it to God. She's cast her ballot for God, and I think that's the beauty of this passage.
Yeah. So as you opened your message, you didn't want to avoid what was on everyone's mind, and that was we had just had an election, and a decisive one at that. Former President Donald Trump won the election decisively. He even won the popular vote, and so he does have this mandate, and so all of us, whether we voted for him or voted for Kamala Harris, we have to accept that and move on. And I thought you had some pretty wise words for the losers and the winners.
Yeah, I mean, my intro to my sermon this week was basically a recap of a video that I put out the day after the election. Selfishly, it's my own way to process. I mean, as an individual, I have my own personal beliefs and I have my own personal wishes, but then the bigger question is, as a pastor, an even bigger question as a Christian, how should we respond? And so I came up with the video the day after the election and thought it was good enough to use again on Sunday. But in terms of how it went on Tuesday last week, some people are hurting and they're afraid. They're scared about what the Trump presidency could mean. And what I suggested was that we need to be careful with that pain. If that's you, we need to be careful with that pain. My dad always says my dad used to say all the time, hurting people hurt other people. And so often we speak from the pain, we live from the pain, and we do things and say things we later regret. So that was the first word of advice. The second one was, if you're on the other side and you're optimistic about what happened, even prideful, I would say be careful with the pride. And that's nothing new in terms of the Christian tradition. In fact, in the Christian tradition, if you look at the 7 deadly sins, the worst sin of them all is pride, or what they called vainglory. And pride has a sort of a blinding effect. Number one, we forget about God when we're prideful. Number two, we forget about others when we're prideful. And then vainglory is another way that it can happen in our lives. And what vainglory is, what they described, the Christian tradition, what we described as vainglory is like it's this need to be worshipped and to live for the applause, that kind of thing. Be careful with that kind of thing as well. And so my advice was to be careful with the pride. And then there was a third category, and I think this is a large group of people in our society today as well. A third response to the election is just indifference. Person says to themselves, what's this have to do with me? They're just numb. And it's been a lot. The last 8 years, it's just been a lot. We've had a pandemic. We've had division in our society. Our own denomination, the United Methodist Church, has had its issues as well. And so I can understand why someone would say, enough's enough. I'm just going to go put my head under a rock somewhere and just move on.
One of the late night shows had a segment where they've recorded this segment on the day after the election and asked people about the election and who they were going to vote for. And so many people were just clueless that the election had even happened, but they tried to act as if the election was that day because that's the way the person asking the question was asking it. And so some people are indifferent to it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe Jesus would call us to be indifferent a little bit. If you were just going to play devil's advocate on different ways that we could apply the gospel. I don't know if we should call it devil's advocate and the gospel going together, but I think people know what I'm trying to say is like Jesus seems to be not so caught up with the roles of the world. In fact, even when we get into our lesson today, he warns against that. Don't get so caught up in these roles and these cultural games and ways that we play out our just the way we live our lives in community. Don't get caught up in that, because if you're not careful, it'll pull you directions you shouldn't go. And so to be clear, I think Jesus does care how elections go. I think Jesus does care how we organize ourselves in terms of the world. But what Jesus would also tell us is don't get so caught up in something that it keeps you or me from living into our deepest values.
Well, and we talked about this last week because we recorded our podcast on Thursday when we typically record on Tuesday, which is what we're doing today. So not only did we record after the election, we recorded at a time when the results were in, when we thought they might not be in. So we did talk about this, and we talked about where is our highest allegiance? And the simple answer is our highest allegiance is to God. And so you posed the question then in this last Sunday sermon, you posed the question, so then what is God calling us to do?
Mm-hmm. And the word of the week for me was integrity. And I got that from my second grader, Ella. She walks out of school one night last week, and I asked her what she learned, and she said, I learned about integrity. I say, what's that mean? And she says, integrity is when you do the right thing, even when it's difficult, even when no one else is looking. And so we as a gospel people who trust in Christ are called to live according to those deep values. And like you're saying, that's our deepest allegiance. And to call oneself a Christian, really, essentially it says that the only life worth living, the world worth having, the only one that ultimately will work is the one that's modeled after the mind and spirit of Jesus Christ. Our short way of saying what I just said there is Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord. And so to have integrity means then I do that, even though the world around me might not be doing that. I'm still called to do that. And I trust also that that's the way of God that's eternal and will ultimately win, even if it doesn't win in our lifetimes.
And we're in the Gospel of Mark, and it's not in this text, but it's not so far away in the Gospel of Mark where we hear Jesus say, take up your cross. And so you talk about giving it all. That's another aspect. The widow gave it all, but we're all asked to give it all, and that goes beyond our money as well. So that's a greater challenge that can ever be posed by the new president. You entered into some of the scriptures to make your point, and you recalled another very familiar story when Jesus calmed the storm.
Yeah,
a little bit earlier in the gospel.
After I talked about modeling ourselves after Christ, then turned to our scripture lesson and then said, look, here we have a picture about what it means to live a Christ-like life. And our lesson this weekend, as we just learned, comes from Mark. And early on in Mark's gospel, there is a famous story that I believe this story is sort of like a lens to see everything Jesus does. We can see Jesus through this lens because it defines his mission, really. And it's the one where Jesus calms the storm. They're in the boat, the storm comes up upon them, they're scared they're going to die. They wake Jesus up, he calms the storm. And we see Jesus doing that again and again throughout the gospel. There's a storm, he calms it. Whether it's a demoniac or something that someone's teaching or forgiving someone of their sin, he confronts the various storms that people face again and again and again. And in our lesson for this weekend, the storm he's confronting, I would suggest, is our own human possessiveness and pride, which is a subtle and deep storm that's hard to really, face. But he starts out talking about be careful with the scribes and the religious people of the time. They like to walk around their fancy robes and say their long prayers, and they want to be worshipped, really. And he's warning against pride here. And we kind of already talked about pride, but one of the things that you always see when someone has fallen into particularly religious pride is they'll use the religion to affirm their egos, but they really don't care about the suffering of others. Mm-hmm. And that's really what he lays out here. He says, they do all these faithful kind of holy things, but yet they devour widows, and that's not it. That's not the picture. Then, in contrast, he tells the story of the widow who puts her coins in the treasury. She gives everything she has, a fraction of the cent, basically what's worth a fraction of a cent, but it's everything to her. And he celebrates really what she does there. And on one level, it's a story about money, right? Like we are called to give our money according to the values of the gospel, according to the values of Christ. We're called to give our money in that way. But it's also a deeper story than that. It's also meant to convey our own spiritual transformation. God has given us all, thus we give all back to God in return. And I think that's one of the reasons why any story that appears in the Gospels is told. There's always the part where it's like, well, okay, that's what it says. We got the scribes over here doing their thing. We got the lady putting her coins, doing her thing. It's pretty straightforward. There's that level of understanding. But always the more helpful way of understanding the text is what's the spiritual implication. And it's more than just about money. It's more than that. It's about giving our all to God. We might think it's small, we might think it's insignificant. We might think the gifts that we have are of little value. But the point of this parable, this story, is Jesus says, no, you give that in gratitude. You give that in faith. You give that with trust in God. And God takes what looks like little gifts and they become huge stories that we're able to tell about the good things God can do through us. And I find it fascinating that this widow that no one else noticed 2,000 years ago does this, what looks like a very insignificant thing. And yet now, 2,000 years later, we're lifting up her story as this is testimony about what God's people should be doing.
And it's fun to think about what might have happened to her. And I think we have to believe that somehow, because she gave it all came back to her in some way, right? That she didn't lose it all. And that was not her motivation. Her motivation was one of love and genuine generosity. But that's the message of giving generously, right? That you get more out of it than you give a lot of times.
Yeah, I don't think she became monetarily or materially wealthy.
Right.
I mean, it's not like that. The reward is the liberation in and of itself. Mm-hmm. Her possessions do not possess her. Mm-hmm. Her status in the world doesn't possess her. She's not caught up worrying about what does other people think about me. She just takes what she has and offers it freely. Here it is. Let it go. And this is liberation, right? That's what it is. And I think that's what Jesus really is getting at again and again in the gospel when he says, you have to deny yourself and take up your cross. And there's some language in the gospels where he even goes as far to say, hate your life. Hate your life, he even says. That's hard stuff. But what he's really saying is like, you got to let it go. You can't let it possess you. You can't let it define you, especially if it's going to keep you from living that life of integrity according to those deepest values. The election might not go your way. You can't let it define you. Mm-hmm. You have to live according to the deeper values as a people of faith. That's what is critical. Not that this other stuff doesn't matter. It does. But that shouldn't determine how one lives their lives. But
you spent some time last week in preparation for the sermon reading and rereading C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, and you found that helpful.
Yeah. Lewis lays out a really good path in terms of what does this non-possessive type of love look like. And he wrote a book called The Four Loves, and I read it in seminary, and for some reason I picked it up last week and was sort of like thumbing through it. And early on, what Lewis says is that there's really two sides of this love that we're called to live into. There's the gift side of love, and then there's the need side of love. And he lays out some different ways that works. But a gift sort of love is like a parent working for the future of their family, even though the parent will not see like, okay, what they do with it after he dies. He just works for the future of his family. It's the gift sort of love. He's not doing it for himself. He's doing it for others, right? And then the need sort of love is like a child wakes up in the night and needs their parent for comfort, or a person turns to their friends for companionship. That's a need sort of love that we all have as well. And so what Lewis basically says, though, is that there's always this gift side of it. There's always a need side of love constantly. But the human tendency is to be possessed by the loves if you're not careful. And what he says basically is if we're not careful, we'll tell ourselves that all these loves feel so good, all we need is love. At which point, he says, if we aren't cautious, if we're not careful, we miss the glory from where the loves came from to begin with. And then, of course, he moves into a conversation about God. When it comes to God, all that we have in this world is gift. And as God's creation, we stand in need. And so as a people of faith, then once we see that, what we become aware of and realize is, what are we to do? Well, we take whatever it is God has given us and we offer it back to God. There's the reward. At the same time, I would argue we're in a position to receive the loves that we've experienced through our lives, which are good. They're not bad, but we are able to receive them in a new way as they're like echoes of this one love that made it possible to begin with. You see, it's this love of God. The gospel teaches us it's this love of God that holds all the other loves in check. And in a sense, it puts them in their proper place. And the problem we get into is when one of these loves in our life becomes so elevated that they become number one. You know, it could be love of family becomes number one. It could be love of your friends becomes number one. It could be love of a romantic partner becomes number one. It takes over one's life. These are, let's be honest, these are temporary things. And so they're good things, but as a people of faith, they're not the thing. And the thing is, of course, the love of God. That's why Jesus would say, what's the number one commandment? It's to love God, which is where the loves came from to begin with. Now, back to the widow real quick. So she's an expression of what that kind of love looks like. She's an expression of faith. She gives all she can. Where does she give it? She gives it to the treasury, the temple. She gives it to God. Symbolically speaking, she gives it to God. Great is her reward. And then on the flip side, the so-called faithful person, they use good religious language, but they're really just possessed by their own position. They're playing the religious game, but they're really not sharing their gifts with others. It's about what they're getting in return, the praise of other people. And so see how subtle it is, how we can get so caught up in this. And we put people on pedestals, we put groups on pedestals, and we sacrifice the deepest truth of our lives.
You like the monks, you like the desert fathers and mothers, and you often tell stories about monks, and I really love the one that you shared this time. And I had never heard this one. Most of those that you share, I've probably heard those somewhere along the way, but I had never heard this one.
Yeah. It was so good. I'm like, I'm just going to tell the story. I don't know how it fits in my sermon. I'm just going to tell it anyway.
Well, I was trying to think of the transition there, and I just went for it.
No, it's good. Yeah, it's good. I mean, the story of the monk the story that I'm getting ready to tell is an illustration of what the widow does in the parable as well, in the story as well. So the story goes, long ago in the early church, there was a monk who was assigned to be the director of a monastery. And so the monk goes on a long journey and gets to the monastery. And once he arrives, he looks so humble that they say, "Oh, great to have you with us. Let us assign you to work in the kitchen." And he quietly goes about it. He washes pots, pans, makes the food for the people in the monastery. And this goes on for like a couple months until finally the bishop shows up. The one who assigned him to begin with shows up, and there he is in the kitchen. The bishop says, "What are you doing?" At which point his true identity is revealed. And I find that to be a very helpful story in terms of integrity. He didn't care about the title. He didn't care about what they thought about him. He wanted to just do the right thing, offer the gifts that had been assigned to him, the role that had been assigned to him, and do it faithfully. And that's what we're called to do as a people of faith. When no one else is watching, we keep doing it. And the faith does say in the end, the truth has a way of coming out as well. We trust that we do it not on our own strength, not with our own power, but we trust that there is a greater power and a greater strength working in the world. And what needs to happen will happen in the end.
And that's the kind of a thing we should be about no matter who wins our elections. And you came back to the election, and you said that you couldn't sleep the night after the election, and again began to question, what's my role? Mm-hmm. What's my role in the midst of this as a pastor?
I didn't get into it in my sermon, but there's a Stoic philosopher by the name of Epictetus. And Epictetus says that one of the major things that happens that gets us into trouble is we do not understand our role. We go beyond the border of really what is ours to do. And that happens in a number of different ways. One of the big ones is we try to control things that we can't control, right? But what he's also saying is that we need to do what is ours to do. And once I thought about that, I mean, this is how my brain works. I think about Stoic philosophers when things happen that are not, according to Andy's plan. I was surprised by the election. I said it in my sermon, I was surprised. I think either side, whoever you voted for, you're going to be surprised. The results were,
they were surprising.
They were surprising. They were what they were. They are what they are. And so anyway, it occurred to me as a person of faith and as a child of God, it's clear what I should do. Number one, I should pray. And I should connect to a source that is greater than my own, which goes back to the earlier on in the podcast, we talked about Jesus calming the storms. I shared that really because that's a powerful reminder that there are limits to there's a limit to our capacity as human beings. There's some storms in this world we can't calm on our own. And it's prideful and it's arrogant to think that there is, we're going to just fix some of this stuff with our own efforts. If anything, the human track record teaches us not always the case. And so in prayer, what happens though, we open ourselves to a source beyond our own. We really open ourselves to the divine energy, which is love. And we always know when we've touched love that comes from God because we're able to do it in a unselfish way, an unpossessive way. And what happens in prayer, really, we start to sense our connection with other people. When we say, I'm going to pray for you, we almost say those things in the church in a trivial way, but that's such a powerful thing that we're saying. I'm going to pray for you. What am I going to do? Randy, if I'm praying for you, I'm going to open myself and realize the spiritual connection that we have. I heard a great term recently, co-inherence happens in prayer. I'm connected to you, you are connected to me in God. And so I pray for my kids when they're in school, we're connected in God. I pray for my wife when she's at work, we're connected in God. I pray for my enemy, people I disagree with, we're connected in God. And not only do we realize our connection, we find a strength beyond ourselves to be able to love in the way that we've been talking about in our podcast today. And so that's the most critical thing that we can do. And the second thing is, after we've prayed, then we're prepared then to offer the gifts that we have. And that's the Christian life in a nutshell. Humbly share the love that's first been given to us by God. Here you go. You do with it what you need to do with it. You respond how you need to respond, but I'm going to continue to give the gift. Here you go. And that could be my time. That could be something like my talents. It could be my money, sure. But, that's the faithful life.
I really liked your description of prayer, and not as you were talking about those things, but this occurred to me fairly recently. Most Christians probably wouldn't say that they're mystics. A very small percentage of Christians would identify that way. I kind of long to be a mystic. I like that. But if you're praying in the way that you described, you're a mystic.
That's it in a nutshell. Yeah, that's mysticism.
Yeah.
You have the experiential knowledge of God now.
Right. Yeah.
What I've noticed happens to me, and this is not just true for Andy. If you look at Christian tradition and even move beyond Christian tradition into other spiritual traditions in the world, what begins to happen in prayer, though, is, Paul talks about it this way. There's a peace that surpasses our understanding. And next, there's this almost natural benevolence that comes out of it. And it's not natural to the person. Again, all is gift, and we stand in need when it comes to God. Absolutely. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to dismiss that in any way. But when we tune into that deep, that divine energy, the divine spirit in our lives, because God is love, we begin to love. And we are even able to love people that I thought, I'm not going to love that person. And somehow we start to love them after we pray for them, right? I mean, that happens. It's a miracle it happens, but it happens. And so, yeah, I go back to that Thomas Merton quote we talked about in our podcast last week, where Merton says, prayer is finding that place within us where God is creating us in this moment. But the funny thing about it is the moment we find the place where God is creating us, we also find the place where God is creating them, whoever they may be, as well. That's mysticism.
Nice. Very good. Okay. Something's going to happen Sunday, which hasn't happened since I've been here, and I got here in July of 2022. And it's this. We're going to we're both going to preach Sunday. You're going to preach here at Methodist Temple. I'm going to preach at Centenary, and we're going to preach on the same text. Now, I know because we talked about it before we pushed record, you've put more thought into your sermon than I put into mine, because Mondays I have Grief Share, Tuesdays I have podcast, Wednesdays I have my Bible study, my Zoom Bible study. So I've had the text open, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. We're just about to go over already. But this will be kind of fun to see, because as we've talked about before, even though we've not preached the same text on the same Sunday before, we've talked about how texts can preach multiple ways. So let me read it. And this follows up on this week's reading, and it's called The Little Apocalypse, chapter 13. And it's the longest speech of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus says is not all that verbal in the Gospel of Mark. It's more of a gospel of action. But this comes right on the heels of the story about the widow's mite, because the very first word in the first verse in chapter 13 is, as they came out of the temple. As they came out of the temple from Jesus having witnessed the widow putting in the 2 coins. So as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Yeah. So I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, and I don't want you to give away your sermon, but just give us a little teaser. But I really like this idea of this is the beginning of the birth pangs. It's not the end, and that's Mark's whole message. This is just the beginning of the gospel. He's not describing the end, he's describing the beginning, and there are birth pangs at the beginning of life, and there's a birth that comes out of that. Okay, that's as far as I'm going to go, and I'm going to work on that. I might go in a totally different direction, but there you go.
That's good. You're right. I mean, that point is being made here for sure, that this is not the end, it's just the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the end of the world as you knew it,
right?
But there's a new one coming as well. And so this weekend in Methodist Temple is Stewardship Sunday, which kind of ironically, we're trying to raise money for the temple, Methodist Temple in our case.
Should have brought back the widow.
And Jesus is talking about destroying the temple. But just to kind of give you a gist of where I might go with my sermon on Sunday is the thing that helps me to understand this passage is to understand also we are the temple. We are the temple in which God dwells. And as the temple in which God dwells, we as human beings have to ask the next question, how do I cooperate with God? And the answer I would suggest is we get back to the basics. And I'm going to talk about what those basics are and then invite people to make their pledge to the ministry of the church next year. So
there you go. We're going to have a fun podcast next week because we will preach from the same text. It'll be 2 completely different messages, but we'll have a lot of fun with it. So, friends, we're so happy that you're listening to us, that you appreciate the podcast, and we hope you have a great week. And hey, stop by Methodist Temple and hear Andy preach, or going out to the north side at Centenary if you'd like to, and you can hear me preach there. And you could listen to both of those virtually at your leisure. Centenary also provides their messages on their website. Thanks again for being with us. Have a great week, and we will see you next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.